The security camera footage would later show exactly 8:47 a.m. when everything changed. A young woman with tangled blonde hair and worn sneakers walked through the marble lobby of Harrison Tower like she owned the place, clutching a yellowed envelope against her chest. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer screen until the woman's trembling voice cut through the morning bustle. "Please, sir, can you read this letter? It's very, very important." 47 floors above, Jonathan Harrison was about to sign a $200 million real estate deal when his assistant knocked. "Mr. Harrison, there's a situation downstairs. Security says there's a woman with a letter that, well, she says it's a matter of life and death." Jack's pen froze above the signature line. Something in his assistant's voice made his blood run cold. In 30 years of business, he'd learned to trust his instincts. This felt different, dangerous. "Send her up," he heard himself say, not knowing he'd just signed his own death warrant. "Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story." Elizabeth Morrison had been awake since 4:30 a.m., same as every day for the past 3 years. By 5:15 she was dressed in her diner uniform, a faded blue dress with Mel's embroidered on the pocket, the stitching coming loose at the edges. Her blonde hair, once her pride, now hung in a perpetual ponytail held together by a rubber band she'd found on the sidewalk. The trailer she shared with her mother sat in Riverside Park, Queens, where the American dream came to die quietly. Lot 47B had been home for 8 years, ever since the factory closed and took her mother's job with it. The aluminum walls were thin enough that she could hear Mrs. Chen next door coughing through the night, and the heating bill that made her choose between warmth and her mother's insulin. "Beth, honey, did you remember to pick up my prescription?" Margaret Morrison's voice drifted from the narrow bedroom, weak but trying to sound cheerful. At 52, diabetes had aged her mother into an old woman, her once strong factory worker's hands now shaking as she tested her blood sugar. "I'll get it after my shift, Mama." Beth lied smoothly, knowing the pharmacy wanted $340 she didn't have. "Dr. Peterson said we could wait another day." The morning routine was practiced choreography. Kiss her mother goodbye, grab the keys to their 1998 Honda Civic with 247,000 miles on the odometer, and drive to Mel's Diner, where she'd spend 8 hours on her feet serving coffee to construction workers and retired cops who left dollar tips on $15 breakfasts. But today felt different. Yesterday, while cleaning out her grandfather's belongings, God rest Thomas Morrison's soul, she'd found something that made her hands shake worse than her mother's ever did. Hidden in a false bottom of his old desk, wrapped in plastic and marked with his careful accountant's handwriting, "For Elizabeth." When you're old enough to understand what justice means. The letter inside was dated 15 years ago, addressed to Harrison Industries, her grandfather's signature at the bottom, along with numbers and account details that meant nothing to her but felt like everything. The paper smelled like his cologne and determination. Jonathan Harrison. She'd looked him up online at the public library. Billionaire, self-made, started with nothing, just like her family. Maybe he'd understand. Maybe he'd listen to a girl whose grandfather died believing in something important enough to hide. That's why she was standing in the marble lobby of Harrison Tower at 8:47 a.m., her heart hammering against her ribs, holding a letter that felt heavier than her entire life. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt like ascending to heaven or hell. Beth couldn't decide which. The mahogany-paneled walls reflected her worn face back at her, making her acutely aware of how out of place she looked. The security guard, a grizzled Vietnam veteran named Eddie, had studied her for a full minute before calling upstairs. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice gentle despite his intimidating appearance, "I've seen a lot of desperate people come through these doors. Most want money. You look like you want justice." There's a difference. Now, walking down the executive corridor toward Jonathan Harrison's office, Beth's sneakers silent on the Persian rugs, she clutched her grandfather's letter like a lifeline. The hallway was longer than her entire trailer, lined with oil paintings worth more than she'd earn in a lifetime. She knocked 3 times on the heavy oak door, each knock echoing like a gunshot. "Come in." Jonathan Harrison looked exactly like his magazine photos, tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her mother's medical bills. But his eyes, when they met hers, held something she hadn't expected: curiosity instead of annoyance. "You must be the young lady with the important letter," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "I have to admit, I'm intrigued. It's not often someone bypasses my entire security system with nothing but determination." Beth perched on the edge of the chair, afraid to lean back into the expensive leather. "Mr. Harrison, sir, my name is Elizabeth Morrison. My grandfather was Thomas Morrison. He worked for the federal housing program 15 years ago, and before he died, he left me this." She held out the envelope with trembling hands. Jack took the letter, noting the careful handwriting, the official federal seal, partially visible through the aged paper. Something about the young woman's earnestness made him set aside his usual businessman's skepticism. He opened the envelope carefully. The first line made his breath catch. "To the Board of Directors, Harrison Industries. I have discovered evidence of systematic money laundering through your real estate development projects, totaling approximately $47 million in diverted federal housing funds." The blood drained from Jack's face as he read further. Account numbers he recognized, shell companies that had mysteriously emerged during his early expansion years. Transactions he'd assumed were legitimate investments from anonymous donors who believed in his vision. "Where did your grandfather get this information?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "He was the senior accountant for the Federal Housing Initiative," Beth replied. "He spent months investigating missing funds meant for low-income housing. Families like mine were supposed to get help, but the money just disappeared." Jack's hands shook as he read Thomas Morrison's meticulous documentation. Every transaction was logged, every shell company traced back to a complex web of political connections. At the bottom of the letter, in Thomas's careful script, Senator William Thornton appears to be the primary orchestrator of this fraud. Harrison Industries may be an unwitting participant, but the company's rapid expansion correlates directly with the missing federal funds. "My grandfather died in a car accident 2 weeks after writing this letter," Beth continued, watching Jack's face carefully. "Single car crash on a clear night, no skid marks. He was the most careful driver I ever knew." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Jack set the letter down and walked to his window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, a view built, he was now realizing, partially on stolen money meant for people like the brave young woman sitting in his office. "Elizabeth," he said finally, turning back to face her, "do you understand what this letter means? If your grandfather was right, it means my entire empire might be built on fraud. It means I've unknowingly laundered money stolen from the very people I thought I was helping by creating jobs and housing." "I know what it means," Beth replied quietly. "It means $50 million that should have helped families get homes went into somebody's pocket instead. It means my mama and me might not be living in a trailer park if that money had gone where it was supposed to go." Jack studied her face, the determined set of her jaw, the steel in her blue eyes despite her obvious nervousness. She reminded him of himself 30 years ago when he'd first arrived in New York with nothing but ambition and a fierce belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Money? A job? A settlement to keep quiet about this?" Beth's response surprised him. "I want the truth, Mr. Harrison. My grandfather died believing he could make a difference. Maybe he was just a small-town accountant, but he was trying to help people like us. If there's still evidence out there, if we can prove what happened." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "Those families deserve their justice. And if you're as innocent as I think you are, you deserve to know the truth too." For the first time in years, Jonathan Harrison felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with profit margins or stock prices. It felt like purpose. Jack's decision came faster than any business deal he'd ever made. Within an hour, he'd cleared his afternoon schedule and assembled a team he could trust absolutely: his head of security, his personal attorney, and his most discreet private investigator. But first, he had to address the elephant in the room. "Elizabeth," he said, settling back into his chair, "before we go any further, you need to understand what we're potentially walking into. If your grandfather was murdered for what he knew, then we're dealing with people who kill to protect their secrets." Beth's blue eyes never wavered. "Mr. Harrison, I've been poor my whole life. I know what powerless feels like. But I also know what my grandfather taught me. Sometimes you have to stand up even when you're scared, especially when you're scared." That afternoon, they drove to Beth's trailer park in Jack's Mercedes, the contrast almost absurd. Beth directed him through streets he'd never seen despite living in New York for 30 years. Neighborhoods where corner stores had bulletproof glass and children played in yards bordered by chain-link fences. "This is where I grew up," Beth said simply as they pulled into Riverside Park. "Lot 47B. That's where the American dream goes to struggle quietly." Margaret Morrison was sitting on their small porch, testing her blood sugar with shaking hands. When she saw the expensive car, her face filled with worry. "Beth, honey, what's going on? Who's this man?" "Mama, this is Mr. Harrison. He's going to help us find out what really happened to Grandpa Thomas." Margaret's face went white. "Beth, no. You don't understand. Your grandfather made me promise." "Promise what, Mrs. Morrison?" Jack asked gently, his businessman's instincts recognizing the fear in her voice. "Promise to let sleeping dogs lie," Margaret whispered. "Thomas called me the night before his accident. He was scared, said he'd stirred up a hornet's nest and might have to disappear for a while. Said if anything happened to him, Beth should never go looking for answers." That evening, while Beth helped her mother prepare dinner in their tiny kitchen, Jack stood outside making phone calls. His private investigator, Marcus Webb, had already found disturbing patterns in the public records. "Jack, I pulled the accident report on Thomas Morrison," Marcus said over the encrypted line. "Single car crash, no witnesses, no skid marks. But here's the interesting part. 3 other federal accountants died in similar accidents that same year. All of them were working on housing fund audits." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "How many others?" 17 deaths over 15 years, all connected to federal housing investigations, car crashes, heart attacks, home invasions gone wrong. The statistical probability of this being coincidence is essentially 0. Through the trailer's thin walls, Jack could hear Beth and her mother talking in hushed tones. Margaret was crying, and Beth's voice carried a determination that reminded him of himself at her age. "Mama, we can't keep living like this. You're rationing your insulin because we can't afford it. I'm working 3 jobs and we're still behind on everything. If Grandpa Thomas died trying to help families like ours, then we owe it to him and to everyone else to finish what he started." When Jack returned inside, Margaret Morrison looked at him with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much struggle. "Mr. Harrison, I don't know why you're helping my daughter, but I need you to understand something. We're not your kind of people. We don't have lawyers or security guards or powerful friends. When people like us cross people with real power, we just disappear. Mrs. Morrison, Jack replied, sitting down at their small kitchen table. 30 years ago, I was exactly your kind of people. I grew up in a coal mining town in Kentucky. My father died in a mine collapse when I was 16. I know what it feels like to be powerless. He pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph. A young man in torn jeans standing beside a rusted pickup truck. That's me at 18, the day I left Kentucky with $300 and a promise to myself that I'd never be helpless again. I built my company because I believed honest work and fair dealing could lift people up. Beth studied the photograph, seeing something in young Jack's eyes that mirrored her own desperation and determination. What changed your mind about helping us? Because, Jack said quietly, if your grandfather was right, then I've spent 30 years unknowingly building my success on money stolen from families exactly like yours. That makes me complicit even if I didn't know it. I can't live with that. Just then, Jack's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Harrison, some investigations are better left alone. The Morrison family has suffered enough. Don't make their suffering worse. Beth saw his face change as he read the message. What is it? Before Jack could answer, Margaret's phone rang. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted but clear. Mrs. Morrison, your daughter has been asking dangerous questions. Remind her what happened to her grandfather when he got too curious. The line went dead. In the silence that followed, they all understood that their investigation had already been noticed by people who preferred shadows to light. Well, Beth said, her voice steadier than she felt, I guess that confirms Grandpa Thomas was murdered. Jack made his decision in that moment. Mrs. Morrison, pack a bag, both of you. You're staying at my penthouse tonight. Tomorrow we start fighting back. Jack's penthouse felt like another planet to Beth and her mother. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan's glittering skyline, and the living room alone was larger than their entire trailer. Margaret sat nervously on the edge of a leather sofa that probably cost more than their annual rent, clutching her insulin kit like a lifeline. I've never been anywhere this fancy, she whispered to Beth. What if I break something? Jack overheard and smiled gently. Mrs. Morrison, I bought this place, but it's never felt like home. Maybe because I've never had anyone to share it with. He gestured toward the kitchen. Please, make yourselves comfortable. There's food in the refrigerator, and the guest rooms are down the hall. While Margaret explored the guest bathroom, marveling at towels thicker than any blanket she'd ever owned, Jack and Beth spread Thomas Morrison's documents across his dining room table. The evidence was damning but incomplete, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle with half the box missing. Look at these dates, Beth said, pointing to a series of transactions. Every time your company received a large anonymous investment, money disappeared from the Federal Housing Fund within days. Jack studied the pattern, his business-trained mind connecting dots he'd been too naive or too busy to see before. Elizabeth, I need to show you something that's going to be hard to hear. He pulled out his laptop and opened his company's financial records from 15 years ago. This is when Harrison Industries really took off. I thought I was just lucky. Anonymous investors believed in my vision, wanted to help me expand. I never questioned where the money came from because I was desperate to succeed. Beth traced the numbers with her finger, seeing the correlation between her grandfather's theft documentation and Jack's company growth. $47 million, she said quietly. And that's how much of your success came from stealing from families like mine. The weight of that realization settled between them like a wall. Jack had built his empire partially on money meant to lift people out of exactly the kind of poverty Beth and her mother lived in daily. I understand if you hate me, Jack said. I understand if you never want to see me again. But I swear to you, Elizabeth, I didn't know. I would never have taken that money if I'd known. Before Beth could respond, Jack's phone rang. Marcus Webb, his private investigator, sounded shaken. Jack, we have a problem. I tried to access federal records on the housing initiative, but they've been classified, not just restricted, completely black-boxed. And my contact at the FBI won't return my calls." "What does that mean?" Beth asked, watching Jack's face grow grim. "It means someone with serious power is covering their tracks," Jack replied. "Elizabeth, what exactly did your mother mean when she said your grandfather might have to disappear?" They found Margaret in the guest room, staring out at the city lights with tears in her eyes. When they asked about Thomas's final phone call, her composure cracked completely. "He called me at midnight," she sobbed. "Said he'd found something bigger than just stolen housing money. Said Senator Thornton wasn't just stealing, he was selling federal land grants to developers, taking kickbacks from construction contracts, even rigging housing lottery systems to favor wealthy investors." Jack felt his stomach drop. "How much money are we talking about?" "Thomas said maybe $300 million over 20 years. Money that was supposed to build affordable housing, provide down payment assistance, fund community development. Instead, it went into private pockets while families like ours stayed homeless or crammed into trailer parks." Beth stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. The Manhattan skyline stretched before her, billions of dollars in real estate, much of it potentially built with money stolen from people like her neighbors at Riverside Park. "All those families," she said, her voice growing stronger. "All those years of choosing between medicine and food, between heat and rent, while some senator got rich off our suffering." Jack joined her at the window. Despite everything, the revelation about his company, the danger they were facing, the vast gulf between their backgrounds, he felt drawn to this young woman's unwavering sense of justice. "Elizabeth, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If we pursue this, if we try to expose Senator Thornton and everyone involved, we're going up against people who've killed to protect their secrets. You could end up like your grandfather." Beth turned to face him, and Jack saw steel in her blue eyes that reminded him of himself at her age, desperate, determined, and utterly fearless when fighting for what was right. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "I've been poor my whole life. I know what it feels like to be powerless. But my grandfather didn't die for nothing. Those families deserve their justice, and you deserve to know the truth about your own company. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "what's the worst that could happen? I'm already struggling to survive." That night, as Beth and her mother slept in luxury they'd never imagined, Jack stood in his office making calls to every contact he'd built over 30 years in business. By morning, he'd assembled a team: FBI agents he trusted, investigative journalists from major newspapers, and a federal prosecutor who specialized in public corruption cases. But he also made another call to his lawyer, instructing him to prepare documents that would transfer $50 million of Harrison Industries assets into a trust fund for affordable housing development. "If I built my fortune on stolen money," he told himself, "then I'll spend whatever it takes to make it right." 3 doors down, Beth lay awake in a bed softer than any she'd ever known, thinking about her grandfather's courage and wondering if she had inherited enough of it to see this fight through to the end. Outside, black SUVs circled the building, their occupants making phone calls to powerful people who were very unhappy about the questions being asked. The meeting was set for Friday morning at the Federal Building in Lower Manhattan. Jack had arranged everything through his most trusted FBI contact, Agent Sarah Collins, a 20-year veteran who specialized in public corruption cases. The plan was simple: present Thomas Morrison's evidence, Jack's financial records, and Beth's testimony to a joint task force of FBI agents and federal prosecutors. But by Thursday night, everything started unraveling. Jack's head of security, Robert Chen, knocked on the penthouse door at 11 p.m. with news that made everyone's blood run cold. "Boss, we've got a problem. 3 of our key witnesses from the housing development cases have disappeared in the past 48 hours. Not dead, just gone. Families evacuated, houses empty, no forwarding addresses. Beth felt her mother's hand grip hers tightly. Just like Grandpa Thomas said might happen, Margaret whispered. People who get too close to the truth just vanish. Jack paced his living room, phone pressed to his ear as he tried reaching Agent Collins. No answer. Her supervisor claimed she was on assignment and couldn't be reached. His lawyer wasn't returning calls. Even Marcus Webb, his private investigator, had gone silent. Something's wrong, Jack said, hanging up from another fruitless call. It's like everyone connected to this case is being systematically isolated. That's when Beth's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check the morning news. Your boyfriend's empire is about to crumble. Last chance to walk away. They turned on the television to find Jack's face plastered across every news channel. The headlines were devastating. Billionaire CEO linked to federal fraud. Harrison Industries under investigation for money laundering. Rags to riches story built on stolen funds. The news reports painted Jack as the mastermind of a complex scheme to steal federal housing money. Anonymous sources claimed he'd deliberately sought out dirty money to fund his expansion. Bank records, somehow obtained by reporters, showed the suspicious transactions Thomas Morrison had documented, but with a different interpretation, Jack as willing participant rather than unwitting victim. "They're framing you," Beth said, watching Jack's face crumble as his life's work was destroyed in real time. "Someone leaked selective information to make you look guilty." Jack's phone rang constantly. Reporters, board members, business partners, all demanding explanations he couldn't give without revealing the larger conspiracy. By dawn, Harrison Industries stock had plummeted 60%. The board was calling emergency meetings. Federal investigators were reportedly preparing search warrants. "This is what they do," Margaret said quietly, watching the news coverage with the resignation of someone who'd seen powerful people destroy the week before. "They don't just kill you anymore. They destroy your reputation, your livelihood, your ability to fight back. Then, if you keep pushing, they kill you, and everyone believes you deserved it." But the worst blow came at 8 a.m. when Agent Collins finally called back. Her voice was cold, professional, completely different from their previous conversations. "Mr. Harrison, I'm calling to inform you that your allegations against Senator Thornton have been investigated and found to be without merit. The evidence you claim to possess appears to be fabricated. We will not be proceeding with any federal case." Jack's stomach dropped. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" "You saw the documents. You said—" "I said a lot of things before I understood the full situation," Collins interrupted. "Mr. Harrison, you're in serious legal jeopardy. My advice is to hire the best criminal defense attorney you can afford and cooperate fully with the federal investigation into your company's activities." After she hung up, Jack sat in stunned silence. Beth watched the man who'd promised to help her fight for justice crumble before her eyes. Everything they'd built over the past week, the evidence, the plan, the hope for justice, had been systematically destroyed by people with power far greater than they'd imagined. "They own everyone," Jack said finally. "The FBI, the media, probably half the Justice Department. We're not fighting corruption. We're fighting the entire system." Beth looked out at the Manhattan skyline, thinking about her grandfather's courage and her mother's quiet strength. Then she turned back to Jack with a determination that surprised them both. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "you told me you grew up powerless and swore you'd never be helpless again. Well, I've been powerless my whole life, and I'm tired of it. Maybe we can't fight the system, but we can still fight for what's right." Jack studied her face. This young woman who had nothing to lose because she'd never had anything to begin with. Despite everything falling apart around them, despite the massive forces arrayed against them, she still believed they could win. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm suggesting we stop playing by their rules," Beth replied. They want to destroy you through the media. Let's use the media. They want to isolate us from official channels. Let's go public. My grandfather died believing the truth matters more than power. Maybe it's time to test that theory. For the first time since the nightmare began, Jack smiled. This trailer park girl with calloused hands and steel in her spine might just be the most dangerous enemy Senator Thornton had ever faced. By Friday afternoon, their world had completely collapsed. The FBI raid on Harrison Industries came at dawn, agents swarming through offices like an army of destruction. Jack watched from his penthouse as news helicopters circled his building, broadcasting the spectacle to millions of viewers who now saw him as a criminal mastermind rather than a victim. The financial destruction was swift and merciless. Harrison Industries stock became worthless overnight. The board voted unanimously to remove Jack as CEO, effective immediately. Banks froze his assets pending federal investigation. Suddenly, the billionaire who'd promised to help Beth fight corruption couldn't even access his own bank accounts. 30 years of work, Jack said, staring at the termination papers his own board had served him, gone in 72 hours. But the personal attacks cut deeper than the financial ruin. The media painted Beth as a gold-digging con artist who'd seduced a wealthy businessman into her grandfather's fantasy conspiracy theory. Photos of her entering Jack's building appeared on every tabloid website with headlines like "Trailer Park Princess Cons Billionaire" and "Poor Girl's Scheme Destroys Empire." Margaret Morrison couldn't handle seeing her daughter's face plastered across newspapers as a scheming manipulator. The diabetes medication Stress sent her blood sugar soaring, and by Friday evening, she was in the emergency room, unconscious and fighting for her life. "This is my fault," Beth sobbed in the hospital waiting room. "I should have burned that letter. I should have left Grandpa Thomas's secrets buried with him. Now Mama might die because I couldn't leave well enough alone." Jack sat beside her, his own world in ruins, but his focus entirely on this young woman who'd lost everything trying to seek justice. "Elizabeth, your mother is sick because she can't afford proper medical care in the richest country in the world. That's not your fault. That's exactly what your grandfather was trying to fix." Dr. Peterson emerged from the ICU with grim news. Margaret's condition was critical. The stress had triggered diabetic ketoacidosis, and her kidneys were failing. She needed immediate dialysis and intensive care that would cost tens of thousands of dollars. Without Jack's frozen assets, Beth couldn't even afford the first day's treatment. "How long does she have?" Beth asked, her voice hollow. "With treatment, she could recover fully," Dr. Peterson said gently. "Without it, maybe 48 hours. That night, as Margaret lay unconscious with machines keeping her alive, Beth made the hardest decision of her life. She called the number from the anonymous text messages and agreed to meet Senator Thornton's representatives. The meeting was in a parking garage in Queens, 3 blocks from Beth's trailer park. 2 men in expensive suits waited beside a black sedan, their faces professionally blank. One handed Beth a legal document and a cashier's check. "Miss Morrison," the first man said, "Senator Thornton wants to resolve this unfortunate situation. This check is for $5 million. The document is a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. You sign this, deposit the check, and your mother receives the best medical care money can buy. You and Mr. Harrison stop making accusations, and everyone goes back to their lives." Beth stared at the check. More money than she'd ever imagined. Enough to save her mother, buy a real house, never worry about bills again. All she had to do was betray her grandfather's memory and let Senator Thornton continue stealing from families like hers. "What happens if I don't sign?" The second man spoke for the first time, his voice cold as winter. "Your mother dies. All Mr. Harrison goes to federal prison for money laundering. You spend the rest of your life branded as a con artist. and the 17 other families who've lost loved ones investigating Senator Thornton's activities never get justice. Beth's hands shook as she held the check. $5 million, her mother's life, Jack's freedom. All she had to do was sign away the truth. "I need time to think," she said. "You have until midnight," the first man replied. "After that, the offer disappears, and your mother's medical insurance mysteriously gets canceled due to administrative errors." Driving back to the hospital in Jack's Mercedes, the repo men would come for it tomorrow. Beth felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her. In the ICU, her mother lay surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed, keeping her tethered to life by the thinnest of threads. Jack found her there at 11:30 p.m., tears streaming down her face as she stared at the unsigned document. "They offered me $5 million, she whispered. "Mama lives, you stay out of prison, and all we have to do is let them win." Jack took her hand, calloused from years of hard work, trembling from the weight of decision. "Elizabeth, what would your grandfather do?" Beth closed her eyes, remembering Thomas Morrison's voice. "Sometimes you have to stand up even when you're scared, especially when you're scared." At 11:59 p.m., she tore the check and the non-disclosure agreement into pieces, letting them fall like snow onto the hospital floor. "We fight," she said. "Whatever it costs, we fight." Saturday morning brought the first miracle in a week of disasters. Margaret Morrison's eyes fluttered open at 6:47 a.m., her first words a whispered, "Beth, honey, why are you crying?" Dr. Peterson couldn't explain her sudden improvement. "Sometimes the human body surprises us," he said, though his eyes suggested he knew there was more to the story. What he didn't mention was the anonymous payment that had covered all of Margaret's medical expenses, or the mysterious benefactor who'd arranged for the state's best diabetes specialist to take over her care. But even Margaret's recovery couldn't lift the crushing weight of their situation. By noon, federal marshals had seized Jack's penthouse. Harrison Industries was in bankruptcy proceedings. The media circus had turned Jack into the most hated man in America, the billionaire who'd built his empire on money stolen from the poor. "We need to disappear," Jack said as they sat in the hospital cafeteria, sharing a meal that cost more than Beth used to spend on food in a week. "I have some offshore accounts they haven't found yet. We could go to Costa Rica, start over somewhere they can't reach us." Beth stirred her coffee with a plastic spoon, thinking about her grandfather's letter and the 17 families who'd lost loved ones seeking justice. Running away won't bring back the people Senator Thornton killed. It won't help the families still living in trailer parks while their housing money sits in his bank accounts. "Elizabeth, we tried. We fought as hard as we could. Sometimes the system wins." "Maybe," Beth said quietly. "But I keep thinking about something Grandpa Thomas used to say, the truth is like water, honey. You can dam it up for a while, but eventually it finds a way through." That afternoon, as they prepared to leave the hospital with Margaret, a young woman approached them in the parking lot. She wore a nurse's uniform and looked nervously over her shoulder before speaking. "Are you Beth Morrison?" she asked. "My name is Susan Walsh. I work in Senator Thornton's office. I've been watching the news, and I think you should know. Your grandfather wasn't the only one who tried to expose the truth." Susan handed Beth a flash drive, her hands shaking. "5 years ago, my husband was an FBI agent investigating housing fraud. He died in a car accident after getting too close to Senator Thornton's operation. Before he died, he made backup copies of everything. I've been too scared to do anything with them, but seeing what they did to you and Mr. Harrison, I can't stay silent anymore." Beth looked at the flash drive, a tiny piece of plastic that might contain the evidence they needed. "Why now? Why risk everything to help us?" "Because," Susan said, tears streaming down her face, "my husband believed the same thing your grandfather did. That sometimes one person standing up for what's right can change everything. He'd want me to be brave enough to finish what he started. That evening, in Margaret's trailer at Riverside Park, the only place they could afford now that Jack's assets were frozen, they connected Susan's flash drive to an old laptop. What they found was devastating. 5 years of additional evidence, including audio recordings of Senator Thornton ordering the deaths of federal investigators, video footage of money transfers, and detailed financial records showing the full scope of the conspiracy. "It's not just housing money," Jack said, scrolling through the files. "Veterans benefits, disaster relief funds, Social Security payments. He's been stealing from every federal program he could access. We're talking about $300 million over 20 years. Beth studied the evidence, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in days. This changes everything. With Susan's husband's investigation combined with Grandpa Thomas's evidence, we can prove the whole conspiracy. But Margaret Morrison, sitting in her own small kitchen for the first time in a week, had concerns that went beyond evidence and legal strategies. "Beth, honey, I need you to understand something. If you do this, if you take on Senator Thornton with everything you've got, there's no going back. He'll come after all of us. You could end up like your grandfather." Beth took her mother's hands, still weak from her recent medical crisis but steady with determination. "Mama, I've been thinking about that. Grandpa Thomas died because he was alone, because he tried to fight the system by himself. But we're not alone. We have each other, we have Jack, we have Susan, and we have the truth." Jack looked around the small trailer that had become their refuge. So different from his penthouse, but somehow feeling more like home than anywhere he'd lived in 30 years. These people had accepted him not because of his wealth or status, but because he'd chosen to stand with them when it mattered. "Elizabeth," he said, "I want you to know something. Even if we lose everything, even if this destroys what's left of my reputation, I've never been prouder of anything in my life than I am of standing beside you and your family." Margaret Morrison studied the man who'd lost billions to help her daughter seek justice, seeing past his expensive clothes to the boy from Kentucky who'd never forgotten what it felt like to be powerless. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "you're welcome at our table for as long as you need a place to belong." Outside, black SUVs cruised slowly through the trailer park, their occupants making phone calls to Senator Thornton. The final battle was about to begin. The final confrontation came not in some dramatic showdown, but in the most American way possible, through the power of democracy and the press. Susan Walsh's evidence, combined with Thomas Morrison's meticulous documentation, created an avalanche that no amount of political power could stop. The breakthrough came when Detective Sarah Collins, the FBI agent who'd claimed the case had no merit, showed up at Margaret's trailer at midnight on Sunday. Her face was bruised, her hands shaking as she knocked on the door. "I'm sorry," she sobbed when Beth answered. "They have my daughter. Senator Thornton's people kidnapped my 12-year-old daughter and said they'd kill her if I didn't shut down the investigation. I've been a federal agent for 20 years and I've never felt so helpless." Jack helped Collins inside, noting the GPS tracker poorly hidden in her jacket. "They're listening," he whispered, pointing to the device. Collins nodded and began speaking loudly about how the investigation was closed while simultaneously writing on a napkin. "Tomorrow, 6 a.m., Channel 7 News, live broadcast, bring everything." By dawn Monday morning, they'd assembled in the studios of WGBS News, where investigative reporter Maria Santos had agreed to air their story live. Collins had retrieved her daughter. The kidnapping had been a bluff designed to control her, and brought 17 boxes of evidence spanning 2 decades of corruption. This is the most comprehensive case of political corruption in modern American history, Maria announced to her morning audience. We're talking about over $300 million in federal funds meant to help America's poorest families, stolen by a network of politicians and business leaders. Senator Thornton's response was swift and vicious. Within an hour, every major news network was airing his press conference from the steps of the Capitol. At 62, William Thornton was a master of political theater, silver-haired, dignified, speaking with the moral authority of 2 decades in office. "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice heavy with false sorrow, "we are witnessing a desperate attempt by a disgraced businessman and his accomplices to deflect blame for their own crimes. Mr. Harrison stole millions from federal housing programs, and now he's using a vulnerable young woman and fabricated evidence to save himself from federal prison." The senator's performance was masterful. He spoke about his own humble origins, his decades of service to the poor, his commitment to affordable housing. He displayed financial records, carefully doctored, that seemed to prove Jack's guilt and his own innocence. "I've spent my entire career fighting for families like the Morrisons," Thornton concluded. "I won't let a billionaire's lies destroy the progress we've made." For 3 hours, it seemed like Thornton would win. His version of events dominated social media. Editorial boards called for Jack's immediate arrest. Even some of Beth's neighbors at Riverside Park began to doubt her story. The senator's performance had been that convincing. Then Susan Walsh played her ace card. During the live broadcast, she connected her laptop to the studio's system and played a recording her FBI agent husband had made 5 years earlier. Senator Thornton's voice filled the airwaves, crystal clear and utterly damning. "The Morrison problem needs to be handled permanently. Make it look like an accident. But send a message to anyone else thinking about playing hero. These federal accountants need to understand that some investigations end with funerals." The recording continued for 12 minutes, detailing 17 specific murders ordered by Thornton over the past 15 years. The senator's voice was unmistakable, his casual discussion of assassination chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. The studio fell silent. Across America, millions of viewers heard a sitting United States senator casually ordering the murders of federal investigators. The revelation was so shocking that many news networks temporarily lost audio, their technical staff too stunned to maintain equipment. But the evidence didn't stop there. Agent Collins presented financial records showing the complete money trail from federal accounts to Thornton's shell companies to Swiss bank accounts. Thomas Morrison's original investigation had been correct in every detail, and Susan's husband had filled in the missing pieces. The final revelation came from an unexpected source. Robert Chen, Jack's former assistant, whom they'd suspected of betrayal, appeared on screen with documents proving his own undercover FBI work. For 3 years, he'd been gathering evidence from inside Harrison Industries, confirming that Jack had been an unwitting victim rather than a willing participant. Mr. Harrison never knew where the anonymous investments came from, Chen testified. Senator Thornton deliberately targeted him because of his background. He knew a poor kid from Kentucky would be grateful for help and wouldn't ask too many questions. By noon, federal marshals were entering Senator Thornton's office with arrest warrants. By evening, prosecutors had charged 47 co-conspirators in the largest political corruption case in American history. The stolen funds, over $300 million, would be returned to their intended purpose: housing assistance for America's most vulnerable families. But for Beth Morrison, sitting in her mother's trailer watching her grandfather's vindication unfold on television, the sweetest moment came when Channel 7 played Thomas Morrison's final recording, a video message he'd made before his death, hidden for 15 years in Susan Walsh's safe. "If you're watching this," Thomas said from the screen, his accountant's precision evident even in his final words, Then the truth has finally come to light. Beth, honey, if you're out there somewhere, I want you to know, sometimes one person standing up for what's right can change everything. Your old grandpa loves you, and he's proud of you for being brave enough to finish what we started. 6 months later, Beth Morrison stood at the podium of the Senate Housing Committee, no longer the nervous young woman in worn sneakers who'd once clutched her grandfather's letter like a lifeline. Dressed in a simple navy suit that Jack had insisted on buying her, she addressed the lawmakers who would vote on the Morrison Housing Reform Act, legislation named in honor of her grandfather's courage. "Senators," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I'm here today not as Elizabeth Morrison the whistleblower, but as Elizabeth Morrison the American citizen who believes this country keeps its promises to its people." The 6 months since Senator Thornton's arrest had transformed all their lives in ways none of them could have imagined. The recovered $300 million had been distributed to families who'd been waiting decades for housing assistance. Margaret Morrison now lived in a modest but comfortable home in Queens, her diabetes well managed with proper medical care. Jack had rebuilt his company on a smaller but entirely legitimate scale, focusing on affordable housing development. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the engagement ring on Beth's finger. Not a massive diamond that screamed wealth, but her grandmother's simple gold band that Jack had found in a pawn shop and had inscribed with Thomas Morrison's favorite saying, "Truth is like water, it always finds a way." The Morrison Act requires complete transparency in federal housing funds, Beth continued her testimony. Every dollar allocated for affordable housing must be tracked from appropriation to construction completion. No more shell companies, no more anonymous donors, no more families wondering why help never comes. In the gallery behind her, Jack sat beside Margaret, both of them beaming with pride. Scattered throughout the room were faces Beth recognized from Riverside Park, neighbors who'd made the trip to Washington to support her testimony. Eddie, the security guard who'd first let her into Harrison Tower, wore his only suit and wiped tears from his eyes as he watched the young woman he'd helped change the course of history. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chair, leaned forward with obvious admiration. "Miss Morrison, your grandfather would be proud of what you've accomplished. But I have to ask, given everything you've endured, the threats, the media attacks, the loss of privacy, do you ever regret delivering that letter?" Beth smiled, thinking of her grandfather's voice on that final recording, of Jack's courage in sacrificing his empire for justice, of her mother's quiet strength through their darkest days. "Senator, my grandfather used to tell me that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. 6 months ago, I was nobody special, just a poor girl working 3 jobs to keep my family afloat. But one letter, one moment of courage, one decision to stand up for what's right, and suddenly none of us were powerless anymore." She paused, looking directly at the cameras broadcasting her words across the nation. "Every American watching this has that same power. You don't need wealth or connections or political influence to make a difference. You just need to care enough about your neighbors to fight for them when nobody else will." The committee voted unanimously to pass the Morrison Act. As Beth left the Capitol steps, reporters shouted questions about her wedding plans, her future political ambitions, her thoughts on becoming a symbol of grassroots activism. "I'm not a symbol," she told them. "I'm just someone who learned that love for family, love for community, love for justice, is more powerful than any amount of money or political influence." That evening, at a small restaurant in Queens where she'd once waited tables for dollar tips, Beth celebrated with the people who mattered most. Jack proposed again, not because the first time hadn't counted, but because he wanted to do it properly, surrounded by the community that had accepted him not for his wealth, but for his character. "Elizabeth Morrison," he said, kneeling beside their table as Margaret cried happy tears and their neighbors applauded. "You saved my soul before I even knew it needed saving. Will you marry a reformed billionaire who's learned that the only fortune worth having is the love of a good woman and the respect of decent people?" "Jack Harrison," Beth replied, pulling him to his feet and kissing him while the whole restaurant cheered. "I thought you'd never ask properly." 3 months later, they were married in the community center at Riverside Park. The guest list included FBI agents and federal prosecutors, former enemies who'd become friends, and an entire trailer park full of neighbors who'd watched one of their own take on the most powerful people in Washington and win. Thomas Morrison's photograph sat on the altar, watching over the ceremony with the gentle smile Beth remembered from childhood. Detective Collins, now heading the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force, served as Beth's matron of honor. Margaret Morrison walked her daughter down the aisle, healthy and proud and radiating the quiet dignity of a woman who'd raised a hero. Jack's vows brought tears to eyes that had seen too much hardship. "Beth, you taught me that wealth without purpose is just numbers on a page. You showed me that real success is measured in lives changed, families helped, and justice served. I promise to spend every day of our marriage living up to the example you set when you walked into my office with nothing but courage and a letter from a man who believed truth matters more than power." Beth's response was simpler but no less profound. "Jack, you could have stayed safe in your penthouse, protected your fortune, and let other people fight for justice. Instead, you chose to stand with us when it cost you everything. That's the man I'm marrying, not the billionaire, but the one who'd rather be honestly poor than dishonestly rich." The reception lasted until dawn, with music and dancing and speeches from people whose lives had been changed by one young woman's refusal to accept injustice. Susan Walsh announced that she was opening a nonprofit organization to help families navigate federal assistance programs. Agent Collins revealed that the task force had recovered an additional $50 million in stolen funds from other corruption cases inspired by the Morrison investigation. But the most moving moment came when Margaret Morrison stood to address the crowd, her voice strong despite her recent health struggles. "My father, Thomas Morrison, died believing that one person standing up for what's right could change everything," she said. "Tonight, looking at all of you, FBI agents and trailer park residents, senators and security guards, all brought together by my daughter's courage, I know he was right. This isn't just Beth and Jack's wedding. It's a celebration of what happens when decent people refuse to let evil win." As the party wound down and cleanup began, Beth and Jack slipped away to the small memorial garden they'd built behind the community center. Thomas Morrison's grave marker was simple granite with his favorite saying, "Truth is like water, it always finds a way." "Think he's proud of us, Grandpa?" Beth whispered, placing her bridal bouquet on the stone. Jack wrapped his arms around his new wife, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city's glow. "Elizabeth, I think he's been watching over us from the beginning. That letter didn't just expose corruption, it brought together two people who needed each other more than they knew." 6 years later, Congressman Beth Morrison Harrison would sponsor landmark legislation reforming campaign finance laws. Jack Harrison's affordable housing developments would provide homes for over 10,000 families. Margaret Morrison would become a national advocate for health care reform, her own struggle with diabetes inspiring legislation to cap insulin prices. But on that wedding night, they were just three people who'd learned that love, for family, for justice, for each other, really could conquer all. The poor girl who'd once delivered a letter that changed everything had become a woman who changed everything. One letter, one law, one life at a time. Message for American seniors. 200 words. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us why we fell in love with America in the first place. Beth Morrison's journey from Trailer Park to Capitol Hill proves what our generation has always known, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they stand up for what's right. Like the heroes of our youth, she didn't need wealth or connections, just the courage to say this isn't right and the determination to fight until it was. Her grandfather's letter reminds us of our own parents' generation, the ones who believed in speaking truth to power, who taught us that character matters more than comfort. In a world that often feels divided and cynical, Beth and Jack's love story shows us that kindness still exists, that justice still matters, and that sometimes a simple act of courage can change everything. Their wedding in that trailer park, surrounded by FBI agents and neighbors alike, proves what we've always believed, that America works best when we take care of each other. What moment in your own life required you to choose between safety and doing what's right? Have you ever seen someone's simple act of courage change an entire community? Share your thoughts below. Our generation has stories worth telling,